people are always asking me for travel advice, like, where should I go in Italy? And I said, would you like to photograph Italian life? Or would you like to photograph other tourists making pictures? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, if you go to those three cities, you are going to be part of a mob of Instagrammers getting their shots. I know there's a certain irony in a guy like me saying that because I've seen all those places. I've photographed all those places before they became crazy.
Greetings and welcome back to the show. If you think travel photography is just nice sunsets and pretty landscapes, wait until you hear what really happens out there in the field. If there's one thing you'll learn in this episode, is that the camera can take you anywhere, even places maybe you shouldn't have gone. I'm Tom Jacob, and this is the Camera Cafe Show. Today, folks, I'm joined by National Geographic photographer Bob Krist, a storyteller who spent nearly 4 decades traveling the world on assignments, capturing not places, but the people and stories behind them. But this conversation goes far beyond travel photography. We talk about what real travel photography actually means in a world driven now by Instagram, quick content, and the me story. Bob shares what it was like working in the golden days of National Geographic, how those assignments really felt behind the scenes, and why slowing down and connecting with people matters more even today. And along the way, of course, there are some incredible stories, a lot of honest reflections, and yes, quite a few laughs as well. So grab your coffee and let's get into it with the one and only Bob Krist. Good evening, Bob, and welcome on the podcast. It's great to see you again and to have a little talk about travel photography tonight.
It's good to be back with you, Tom.
Bob, before we start, this interview is approved by your wife, Peggy. She told you we can do it?
Yes.
I don't want to get in trouble, Bob.
No, you won't get in trouble. Don't worry. She's very open-minded and understanding. As long as I don't talk smack about her, I should be fine.
We will try to avoid that. Bob, can I call you Bob, or do I have to say Sir Krist? Because I think there was a voodoo ritual somewhere you were knighted.
Yes. That was back in the hills of Trinidad back in the early 80s. I was working on a travel story for Islands magazine, which was a magazine that did coverage about different islands all over the world. And we were in Trinidad, and the writer was very interested in the occult. And I had seen some voodoo in Haiti on a previous assignment, and I wasn't too anxious to see it again. But she kept putting out the word that she wanted to see voodoo. Well, ironically, she kind of caught a case of the vapors and left before the assignment was over. And one night at my hotel, I got a knock on the door, and there were 3 guys that said, "You the man that want to see voodoo?" And I'm like, well, and they said, "Come on." And they just took me up into the hills of Laventille, a neighborhood above Port of Spain. And you could hear the drums going, before you could see it. And there was just this little, almost open-sided garage with these guys drumming who proceeded to drum for the next 8 hours without stopping. It was amazing. And at one point, a woman in the audience kind of fell into a trance, and she picked up a machete, and she was swinging it around, and she was casting spells on people. And then she pointed at me, and they dragged me to the middle of the circle, and they pushed me down on my knees, and she had the sword above her head. And this was long before they started killing and dismembering journalists. So I just kept saying to myself, she's not going to kill me. I mean, that would get her in trouble. But I wasn't exactly sure, but I locked eyes with her, and it was fight or flee, and I decided just to stay and lock eyes. And instead of hurting me or whatever, she just came down and like knighted me on each shoulder, and then they dragged me back, and I was, just like, I was terrified. I was, shaking because it was a gamble, and I wasn't sure if it would have paid off. And finally, in the morning, when the sun rose and people kind of came out of their trances, there was a guy there, one of the guys that brought me. I said, "What happened there last night?" And he said, "Well, you were accepted by the god Shango." And I said, "Okay." I said, "What would rejection have involved?" And he said, "You don't want to know, man. You don't want to know." So I think That's probably the scariest thing that has ever happened to me because, I did soft cultural travel. I wasn't a war photographer or a conflict photographer, but that was about as deep into a culture as I wanted to get at that time. And again, it was a different world. I think now I would have been screaming, running from there because the rules
Mm.
are a little different. There seemed to be a lot less when it comes to handling journalists these days. But in those days, I don't know, maybe I was young and naive, but I thought as long as I keep her eyes locked with this woman, I'll be okay. So anyway, it worked okay. I'm here to tell the story, so it
Mhm.
had a happy ending.
And you felt some of that luck that it brought you throughout your life?
Yeah, yeah. It's funny, and a lot of people don't want to admit this, whether they're photographers or not, but luck plays a lot bigger role in all of our lives than I think we'd like to acknowledge. Now there is a certain aspect of the harder you work, the luckier you get. But there's certain points in a career where something happens as opposed to something else, and that opens up a door that may not have been
Mm.
open. And I remember one of the first times I went down to the National Geographic and I showed my portfolio to the then assistant director of photography, Ken Koberstein. He was looking through my pictures, and he said, "Well," and he's quite he's a buster. He loves to bust your chops. He said, "I've always said it's better to be lucky than good." But I've taken a lot of insults like that in my career. But he meant, we're very good friends to this day. But I thought, wait, that's a left-handed insult if I ever heard one.
Yeah.
A left-handed compliment, actually. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Bob, let's walk a bit back because before all the riches, the fame, the assignments, there was acting and a year living in London as an
Yes.
actor. So, how exactly does an actor end up with a camera and goes to National Geographic?
Well, in college, the theater was my first love. I was a philosophy major and a theater minor, and I really wanted to be an actor. And I had auditioned for a local professional theater company that had gotten a grant to tour Europe, and I got into the company. So they had a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts to tour Europe. There used to be an English language theater circuit in Western Europe called the Mickery Circuit. Mickery Theater in Amsterdam was the home, and then there was like one in Paris and one in Vienna and one in Berlin, and so I was saving up for a stereo at that point, but I decided I couldn't, carry a turntable and speakers all over Europe. So I bought a camera instead. And so we got over and we got into Amsterdam. We lived in a house, a communal house. This is in the early 70s. And one of the other actors was a pretty good photographer, and he kind of took me under his wing. And acting is mostly night work, so during the days we'd wander around these beautiful European capitals taking pictures and trying to meet girls. And that's how I first got my interest in photography and travel. It was a lot of fun wandering around Paris with a camera and seeing all these great things, and I developed quite a taste for it. And I did that for about a year, and then I kind of moved to London for almost another year. The tour was over, and I thought I could make it big in London, and I did make it big as a pub bartender and a grill chef. I did one Guinness commercial, and I did one fringe theater thing. I was unable to find a British girlfriend, and so after that, I came back and I finished up my degree, and then I spent a couple of years in a couple of regional theaters in San Francisco, in Berkeley, California, and in Philly. And in '76, there was a big recession here in the States, and we lost our funding, and I was broke. And I went home to live above my parents' garage in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which is right across the Hudson from Manhattan. And I was going to hit the auditions. And the kid that grew up next door to me was an English major, and he turned out to be a reporter at a local paper. And he said, we're looking for photographers, you know. And at that point, I had done travel photography. I had done headshots of beautiful actresses. I had done
Mm.
travel, you know, all my travel stuff. And I said, well, you know, I've never done any news photography. And he said, yeah, but, you know, it pays $140 a week. And I said, every week? Wow. Okay. So I put on my best suit and I went down to Union City, New Jersey with my pictures of actresses in Europe and headshots. And the editor was like looking at it saying, what is this? You know, he said, but you know, it's clear that you have no experience, but you do look very professional in your suit and tie. So I'm going to give you a 3-week tryout. So he gave me a 3-week tryout. And I was thinking 3 weeks, 3 times 140, that's pretty good money. I could, you know. So, and during my first 3 weeks, I had the luck. You know, there was a major fire. I was on my way to shoot a high school basketball game, and I saw a column of smoke deep in the heart of Jersey City. And, you know, I'm an actor, so I'm thinking, what would an actor do? What's my motivation? Would he go to the high school basketball game, or would he follow the smoke and the sirens? And I followed the smoke and the sirens, and they were, you know, passing old ladies out of burning windows,
Mhm.
I was right there, and this was like more reality than I had seen in my previous 24 years of living. My hands are shaking, and I'm taking these pictures, and I go back to the office of the newspaper, and one of the old timers said, well, how'd you do, kid? I said, I don't know. There was ladies, they had to rescue this lady out of the flames were everywhere. He's like, give me the film. And he loaded it up, and I had page one and like a whole page spread of pictures on the inside. And a couple of other things happened to me during that 3 weeks. So when the 3 weeks was over, the editor was convinced that he had the idiot savant of spot news photography, you know, on his hands. So he hired me, and I was going to stay just long enough to pay off my credit card debt. But I got kind of hooked on it, the whole process. And I ended up staying at the paper for almost 5 years. And I kept saying, I'm going to go back. this is great research. All these characters I was meeting would be great, you know, for my acting, you know, to inspiration and stuff. But I slowly got more and more hooked on the storytelling and the whole thing of dropping into other people's lives. But I wasn't a news guy. My instinct for news is to run the other way. When I see bedlam, I want to run away. I don't run towards it. So that's a kind of a disqualifying aspect if you're a news photographer. And I had traveled and I wanted to travel. And in those days, if you were an award-winning newspaper photographer, you could get an appointment with the director of photography of National Geographic. And I had won Northeast News Photographer of the Year or something.
Mhm.
And I went down there and with my pictures of fires and stuff like that. And I was very confident, you know, because I was 5 years into it and I was Northeast News Photographer of the Year. And I go and I'm sitting in the anteroom of Bob Gilka's
Mhm.
office. And he's got a little sign outside the door that said, please wipe your knees before entering. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I go in there and he tears my tears my portfolio apart. You don't, you know, I had no color. It was all black and white, you know, and everything. But I had remembered doing some research where he said that he needed story ideas. He used to say that he was up to his eyeballs in talent, but only ankle deep in good story ideas. So I was an English major, right? I wrote up 10 story proposals for him that I pitched, you know, pitches. And they were all exotic, French Polynesia, all these things, Papua New Guinea, all these exotic places I wanted to go. And
Mm.
he's flipping through them and he's like, why would I send you? These are, you know, this is good idea, but why would I send you? And at the very bottom was a pitch. Back in the day, National Geographic used to do these state profiles of each state in America. And I wrote this proposal, the New Jersey nobody knows. And he actually had to do New Jersey. And he said, you know, I can't give this assignment away to the more experienced photographers. So why don't you take New Jersey and see how you do? And that's how I got my foot in the door with National Geographic. I had a flawed debut. My dear friend Mike Yamashita, who was several years ahead of me in experience and also a Jersey boy, he came in and between the two of us, we finished off the story. But it was the beginning of my tenure down there, and it lasted about I hung on for a good 37 years or so down there. So, but again, as you say, it's luck, but it's luck and preparation. Luck and preparation. Luck favors the prepared. So I'm a great believer in luck, and like Mike says, um, photographers are paid to be lucky, and that's kind of true. But luck favors the prepared, and so that's always been my approach, to try to prepare, do as much hard work as possible, and then you just kind of leave it up to the forces of the universe to help guide you.
Talk me more about Bob Gilka, because then you have the pictures, or you think you have the pictures, and you have to go to present them. You felt nervous every time going inside?
Oh, yes, yes. The Geographic is based in DC, and I was based in the New York area and then later in Philly for most of my career. And I used to just get stomach knots and all kinds of stomach problems every time I had to go down to the Geographic, because the place was just dripping with pressure, and there was always these famous photographers around. So it was a very stressful thing. Now, Gilka was a guy with a crusty exterior and kind of a tough, gruff guy, but he had a heart of gold underneath, and fortunately, he took a shine to me, so he helped me early on and everything. But I used to say, after my first projection session, when you and your picture editor, sometimes the director of photography, you go up to the editor in chief's office and you project your tray of 40 to 80 slides for the story, and they say yay or nay. So it's a very existential experience, and I like to say that I don't fear Judgment Day, because I've been through a number of projection sessions at the National Geographic, and nothing could be worse than that. Give me eternity in hell over the displeasure of a Geographic editor. So
And how was National Geographic in those days, Bob? How much freedom you got to do?
we had a lot of freedom, and we had a lot of money. They took away the two classic excuses that photographers always give you. I didn't have the time, and I didn't have the money. Well, now you have the time and they have the money. You just have to give them the kind of pictures that they're looking for. So my first kind of encounter with that was like on my New Jersey story. I wanted to do a thing about how New Jersey was like this transportation hub. And there's this one section of the New Jersey Turnpike through beautiful Newark, where you get Newark Airport, you get Port Elizabeth, you get the New Jersey Turnpike, the busiest road in America, and you can get it all in one frame, but you got to kind of get up in the air. So I called my picture editor saying, do I have permission to hire a helicopter? It costs $800 an hour. And she was really gruff and she said, honey, if you want to hire a helicopter, hire a helicopter. If you want to hire 5 helicopters, hire 5 helicopters. Just bring back the pictures. And I'm like, well, okay, I understand. I was coming from a newspaper where if I supersized my fries at McDonald's, I had to have permission in triplicate from the editor to spend more on lunch. And then here, all of a sudden, you're in a place where it's like, now that has changed. That has changed severely since those days. And I understand now, under the latest ownership, Disney, that things are very, very, very tight. And that golden age when the Geographic had, I think when I started working for them, they had 14 million subscribers. And I don't know what they have. When I stopped, it was down to 2.5 million, and it may be lower even now. So those days are over, and they were starting to end even as I was coming into my own. I think the 60s and the 70s was the halcyon days there. By the time I got there in the early 80s, things were starting to crank down a little, and then I kind of segued when my wife and I started having kids. I missed my youngest boy's. Well, I made his birth, but I had to leave on an assignment, and I saw him when he was like 3 days old, and I didn't see him again till he was 4 months old.
Yeah.
And that wasn't working for any of us.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, National Geographic was launching a second magazine called Traveler Magazine, which was more not so much photojournalism, it was travel photography. It was something they launched in answer to the readers requesting, what can I do when I go to these fabulous places? The Geographic would show you the way of life of the people who live there, but everybody always wanted to know, well, which hotels are good and what restaurants and what can I do? So they launched this travel magazine. So that was shorter assignments. They were 2 and 3 weeks. And I went to Mr. Gilka and I said, I would really like to try this traveler magazine because I'd like to be home more. And he said, there's a lot of kind of friction between that magazine and the main magazine. And if you jump over there, you might have trouble getting back in with the yellow magazine. And I said, well, I'd rather risk that than risk my family. So I kind of went over to Traveler and I did books. And so most of my years, the first 5 or 7 years were for the regular magazine. And after that, I was mostly doing Traveler assignments. And I was very happy for that. It was fine. It was a lot easier to maintain a family. I think I'm probably one of only 3 or 4 of the cadre of maybe 100 photographers of my general age group down there who are still with their initial spouses. So it's a tough career on marriages, but this
Yeah.
made it a little easier to handle because the time away from home was more reasonable. 2 or 3 weeks, not 3 or 4 months. So the prestige, not as great, but that was okay because the money was actually better because they had editions all over the world. There was a French edition, a German edition, and every time it ran, this was before, again, all our rights were stripped from us, or, we would get paid another 50% of what we initially got paid. So a traveler assignment was worth its weight in gold. It was wonderful.
I think, Bob, you told me that there was also a sign somewhere up that says, "We publish pictures, not
Yeah,
excuses."
yeah.
You ever came close to find an excuse for something they send you?
I never technically blew an assignment. I always came back with something. Yeah, that sign was above Dan Westergren's iMac, and it's, "We publish pictures, not excuses." I never blew a whole assignment. I disappointed them on certain assignments, I'm sure, but nothing I ever did was so bad that it was unpublishable, or. So I was kind of steady Eddie that way. I had another picture editor who I worked with over the years who was a brilliant guy named Bill Black, and he was the photo editor at Travel Holiday. And he explained to me once, he said, I use guys like you and Michael Melford and everything because I know what you're going to shoot and I know you're going to bring home the bacon, but I know what it's going to look like before you come in. He said, but I use you so I can take risks on Antonin Tocqueville and these other artistes who blow 1 out of every 3 assignments I give them. But the one that comes through is brilliant and original. So I was a little upset by that, but in the end, we all have our roles to play. And
Mhm.
and my role was the concierge supplier of really good, solid storytelling imagery. I wasn't brilliant. I wasn't mercurial, but anything I shot was publishable. So Bill built his stable with some horses that he could really depend on, and then some superstar horses who, if they didn't fall in the mud, would be miles ahead of everybody. But they fell a lot. So
Mhm. Mhm.
so we all had our roles to play in the stable of a picture editor, and I was one of those. I like to say concierge suppliers. I never complained. I never called. I was sick. I had emergency eye surgery in Italy on one assignment. Nobody ever heard from me back there. I just handled it. I did the job, and I handed in the pictures. So my thing, whereas some of these other photographers, and this is truthful, would only travel with their masseuse and needed a first class seat for their dog and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm like, really? you paid for a traveling masseuse and first class for a dog? And I was like, yeah, well, yeah, we paid for that, you know. So that I was not one of those. I was the quiet guy who just got it done, handed it in, and hoped that they had a couple more assignments to give me.
I'm very proud of you, Bob. I had to almost close the interview if you told me you took first class seats.
No, I never rated that kind of star treatment.
And film roles, how I have to imagine this? You brought all your film roles in the beginning, or they send you more when you needed them?
No, you kind of had to travel with what you wanted. Like when I went to Iceland for them in the mid 80s, it was really hard to ship stuff back and forth from Iceland. So I would go out with like 300 rolls of film, and that would last me for, some months. And, you had a big bag of it and you had to get it through X-ray and everything like that. And then you'd ship it back in these little boxes. They'd give you these yellow boxes. And before there was FedEx, there was DHL or air freight. And so you'd shoot 25, 30 rolls and ship it to the Geographic. You wouldn't know what it looked like. You wouldn't know if you had blown the assignment. You wouldn't know anything. And they had a department down at the old Geographic called Film Review. And their job was not to judge your pictures other than to look at them and say, the exposure's fine, the focus appears to be fine, there's no sand in the shutter, you're not scratching the film. So we've got it. The film looks good. Your picture editor will tell you if the pictures are any good, but we'll tell you that your cameras are working and or not working. I had one assignment where I shipped the film down and they said, your camera too got a piece of sand early on, and every picture that you shot with that camera for this, it was a 10-day road trip across Pennsylvania. It was a short story for Traveler. They said one of your cameras, nothing that came out didn't have this big major scratch across the middle of it. But fortunately, I shot 2 cameras and I tended to overshoot. And the editor looked at it. He said, you got enough with the other camera. I'm not even going to tell the editor you had a problem with your other camera. We'll just show what you got and nobody will ever tell the difference. So, there was a certain belt and suspenders type of, you'd shoot it on one roll, you'd shoot it on another roll, or you shoot something on one camera, you'd make sure to shoot it on the other camera just in case something like that happened. That's the only time that ever happened to me. The other thing that happened to me was when I was up in Iceland for the main magazine back in '86. I shipped a roll, and this was the roll that we finally got to photograph the president of Iceland. It was the roll that contained like a 6-hour helicopter trip across southern Iceland in beautiful light, and it never made it to Washington. And it was shipped by Iceland Air Freight. And Iceland Air said, "Oh, it was stolen at JFK Airport." And and then I'm like, "Oh my God, I got to go back and reshoot this." And it was getting near the end of my assigned time, and you can't guarantee 6 hours of beautiful light in Iceland with a helicopter, to repeat that. And finally, some guy in Spokane, Washington, who was on a fly fishing trip, finally unpacked his fly fishing gear, and there was this orange box that said National Geographic. And God bless him, he forwarded to the Geographic, and that was my shipment. It had somehow gotten mixed up with his fishing gear, and so they found it after 6 weeks, and a lot of those pictures did make the final layout. They would have been hard to duplicate, but thank God. I'll never forget. I think I sent him like a big bottle of champagne or something, because he could have just as easily looked at it and tossed it in the garbage, but he forwarded it to the Geographic and he saved my bacon. Luck. See, luck.
It comes back all the time.
Yes.
I think we discussed this already one time, Bob, that this was film, and in the end of your day, you close the box, you write some notes, and you go to the pub. And then came digital, and then a whole other beast.
Yeah, there digital giveth and digital taketh away. And what happened when you're on the road for long-term jobs, you try to have some semblance of a life. And when you were shooting film, you would come back, you'd write your captions, that you can remember, match it to the roll of film. You'd usually number them and everything. And at the end of the day, you'd throw your shot film in a bag and you'd go off to the pub, or you'd go to the movies, or you'd read a book at dinner and stuff like that. And you had a life, a little bit of a life on the road. But once digital came in, now, wow, the luxury of knowing that you had it all there and stuff, but you had to now back it up and put all the captions in on each picture and stuff. So we became like digital monks. When you're traveling, you shoot all day and you're backing up and renaming and making copies all night. And your life on the road, you didn't have a life. So I'd like to refer to us as digital monks, but I don't know, you talk to more photographers than I do. I don't know anybody who would trade the peace of mind of knowing what you got with digital for the lifestyle of throwing film in a bag and going off to the pub. I wouldn't go back to film as much as a pain digital is to wrangle on the road. Just to have that, just to see the pictures and everything is so reassuring, because boy, the insecurity of shipping 30 rolls of film to a magazine like the Geographic, where 50 of the world's best photographers are also shipping their film, and you don't know what you got. That was anxiety. That was real anxiety.
Well, by the time this interview comes out, I spoke to Graham Watson, who shot for 40 years all big cycling tours, Tour de France, the Giro, and everything. And he was very happy with digital because he was not like you. He had to develop after each race his own film, make pictures, make the slides, send the slides off. And he says, one digital came. 5 minutes on the computer, I send it and it's done. So
Yeah.
He was very happy.
Oh yeah, well, for the news guys, it's incomparable for news guys. I mean, you hear all these stories, these classic stories. I don't know if you're familiar with a Scottish photographer named Harry Benson. I don't. Harry was, with part of the Fleet Street guy before he broke out as a famous life photographer. He was part of the Fleet Street gang. Fleet Street being the British tabloids and stuff. And the famous Harry Benson story is that they were shooting the Beatles in Bahamas, and it was a press trip, and all the London guys were there, and they were coming up on deadline, and the plane was leaving, and Harry said, "Oh, chaps, I'll take the film. I'll take the film to the airport. I'll shuttle it." And how he is alive, or how he lived through this, he took everybody's film, he drove to the airport, he threw theirs in the ocean, and only shipped his back. So he had the exclusive. Now, why they didn't kill him, I don't know, but that kind of thing doesn't happen when you're shooting digital and transmitting yourself. Harry tells that story, or he told that story quite proudly, and I was like, dude, you're lucky to be alive.
Bob, let's talk a bit about another part of the podcast is real travel photography. Because in the age we live now of Instagram and everybody wants to be an influencer, and a lot of pictures, it's travel, but it's me.
Yes.
What do you think? I think people are losing out a big part of travel photography with closing themselves and only showing themselves.
Yeah.
What does it mean to you, real travel photography?
Well, what it means in a nutshell is that when you're traveling with your camera, it should be about the people who are there. It's not about you. But unfortunately, thanks to Instagram and selfies and influencers and stuff, travel photography has become, I call it vacation photography. It's more about saying, "Hey, look at me, I'm in a cool place. Isn't this cool?" And it's like you're fomenting FOMO in your viewers instead of informing them about the culture that you're supposed to be covering. I see this a lot. You know that in the last 10, 12 years, I've become very interested. I spend most of my time in film, in the film world now, making short documentaries. And I see this all the time in the so-called travel videos on YouTube. They're not travel videos, they're vacation videos. They're our host, our influencer, saying, "Well, now I'm here, and boy, this is really cool." And they'll go through a whole country and they will not turn around and photograph somebody in the from the country. It's all me, 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 me. And I think that whole Instagram shooting for the gram, it has caught on to the point where, well, it's one of the reasons I think where you find these anti-tourism demonstrations. It's part of a thing now, where tourism is, instead of being an enlightened reaching out to learn about another culture, it's like, how much fun can I have at my Airbnb, and how cheaply can I travel, and how many selfies can I get? It's trophy hunting. It's not real cultural encounter. And I think, of course, the economics, I think, of why we have these demonstrations in Spain and places is more about the lack of affordability of local housing for the locals, because everybody's bought their houses and made them into Airbnbs to get the tourists over. I think that's the primary reason. But I also think that the selfie mentality contributes to that thing. So you're reaching the point now where you have countries that used to welcome tourists are saying tourists go home, and we're reaching a critical point with that. And so, in my own way, with my films, and what I try to kind of preach to travel photographers is, stop looking for travel notches on your belt and start doing slow travel and really digging in. Like I often say, people are always asking me for travel advice, like, where should I go in Italy? I want to go to Rome and Venice and Florence. And I said, well, would you like to photograph Italian life, or would you like to photograph other tourists making pictures? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, if you go to those three cities, you are going to be part of a mob of Instagrammers getting their shots of them in front of the Trevi Fountain and the Roman steps or the Spanish steps and stuff. But if you really want to capture Italian life and see plenty of beautiful churches and art and everything, you go to the second cities, Torino, Bologna, where you got a half a chance of seeing Italian life being lived by Italians, rather than this kind of Disneyland attraction of the world's great sites. Now, I know there's a certain irony in a guy like me saying that, because I've seen all those places. I've photographed all those places before they became crazy. And so it's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, you don't want to do the great sites. Take it from me, kids. And I realize the irony, or I'm advocating something that I did, but that's that's just strictly the luck of when you were born, and I was born early enough that travel had not become entirely commodified. But I think for people to have real encounters, they've got to slow down. They've got to really stop worrying about notches on their belt. And this is what I'm doing with my films now. I spent 5 weeks in a little town in your country, your adopted country, Spain, that not too many people go to. Everybody goes to Sevilla and all these other places. We were in Jerez de la Frontera for 5 weeks last winter, and I hardly heard another American accent. I heard English, of course, and German, but we really dug in and did stories on the sherry industry, on the flamenco, and really became part of the town. And these kind of experiences, these kind of encounters, where you're really documenting the people and you're really digging, I think they're deeper than here's me and my gram in front of the Spanish Steps and stuff. So if I have a cause now, when a young photographer or somebody even my age who asks my travel advice, I'm really trying to recommend people to slow down, look at the second cities, look at the countryside, and really try to have the experience that travel is supposed to give you. Not this mad dash for Instagram likes, but a real encounter with people who are different than you. And you see the surface differences with culture, but then you see all the universality of mankind. Everybody wants a better life for their kids. Everybody wants to spend time with. Everybody wants this and that. But whether they wear a Hooli Wigman mask or a Spanish hat or whatever, so you see the common humanity. And I think particularly for Americans, it's really important because as a people, we have become very xenophobic, very fearful of what's different. And we travel in cruise ships with thousands of people. And it's like, like these capsules and stuff like that. And you see what's happening over here now as a result of that. So I think it's important that people drop their fear, especially, as a European, you don't see this because you've always had to take in other cultures. You in Belgium, especially, I mean, you're surrounded by four different languages and everything. But over here, you drive 2,000 miles and they're still speaking what passes for English. Sometimes here in Maine, I'm not sure what the accent is. I can't get there from here. But I think it's important for Americans especially to get out, get away from the groups, get in and boy, it's a wonderful experience because I think still people are open to being visited by Americans. I don't know how much longer that's going to last, quite honestly, but it's something I really recommend for travelers is to not travel in groups, to travel. And yes, you'll be a little uncomfortable and in the beginning and stuff. It happens to me at the beginning of every assignment. I got into Jerez with my wife and I was like, I can't speak a word of this language. I can't even order the right beer. How am I ever going to do this? And by the end, I was like, oh, how could I leave my friends at the sherry place and everything? And I tend to fall in love with every place I spend a little time. So my wife will tell you, I've come back from so many places saying, honey, we're going to move there. And she's like, we got 3 kids in school here. We can't move to New Zealand. Oh, but it's so beautiful. And she lets me rant on a little, and we ended up not moving. But I tend to do, after I spend a little time, I tend to fall in love with where I am. There are a few places that I didn't, but there are far many more places where I said, oh, I could live here. I'd love to live here.
Well, if you come now to Spain, Bob, at the moment this week, the Bulls, they are running in Pamplona. I can
Oh,
take you there and you can run.
no, no, my running days are over. I never did that, and by the time I maybe could have done it, I was too old, and I'm not one of those daring guys. I did a documentary because one of my earliest experiences overseas. Interesting that you bring up bulls because it's fascinating. One of my earliest travels overseas, I was still on the newspaper, and I kind of gave myself an assignment. We had a little money. Peggy and I went over to Portugal, and we spent a month in Portugal. And I was in this town called Villafranca de Chira, and I was in this dusty square, and they were kind of putting up like blockades and everything all around the square. And I was like, what's going on? And of course, I couldn't speak the language and I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't ask anybody. And in those days, we're talking now the 80s, English was not widely spoken in Portugal. So I couldn't ask what was going on. Well, what was going on was they were blocking off the town square and they were going to release a bunch of bulls that everybody was going to run around in front of. And of course, the bulls come rocketing out and I'm like, holy smoke, there's no escape. And I'm kind of shooting, but I'm frozen in my tracks. And finally, I scrambled over a wall. I'll never forget this. This was the days of metal lens hoods. I had a 24 and a 105 on my 2 cameras, and those lens hoods were squashed because the adrenaline. I just leapt up this wall and like clawed my way up. And I was like, and these guys are running and pulling things off the bull's horns. I'm like, you people are crazy. So I've been fascinated by that. And I went to a Portuguese bullfight where the unarmed forcados at the end, they challenged the bull to run in and they jump on him. And I've been fascinated ever since for 40 years about what possesses a guy unarmed to have a bull charge at him. And I finally went back to the Azores and I did a whole documentary about the forcados there. And I got that out of my system. And it's one of the films that I like the best. And it's been doing pretty well in film festivals. And it's basically the story of one of these forcados, and how the bullfighting culture comes tied in with the cult of the Holy Ghost and a lot of other things that go on in the Azores and stuff. But it was a 40-year fascination because I almost I almost got
Mhm.
killed that first time, and I wanted to know, why would anybody volunteer to do that? So one of my long-term questions. Now, I pitched that story for 30 years to magazines, but everybody said, "Oh, bullfighting, bullfighting. Oh no, it'll never." But they don't kill the bull over there. So finally, when I started doing my own documentaries and I started funding it myself, I was like, you know what? I'm doing that story. I don't care who doesn't like it. And it's done pretty well in the film festival. So yeah, but I would never run before the bulls in Pamplona. I did, or anything like that. I that's why I'm fascinated with people who would. What
Mhm.
is the makeup? Why do they do that? My instinct is for self-preservation, but there's a whole thing about pride and macho culture and all this other kind of stuff that I strive to understand because it's very foreign to me. And that's why I do what I do.
Yes, but not with a 24 millimeter.
No, not anymore.
Take it.
No. No, I'm behind the wood wall with nice long telephotos now.
Exactly, exactly. Bob, when you were out shooting travel photography, what's for you a visual cue that tells you there is a story here that is worth staying for?
That's a good question. Sometimes I like to say that you kind of use all your senses when you're looking for a good travel photograph, and besides your eyes. And so, like, I remember I was doing a story in New Orleans for Travel Holiday, and it was hot and it was the middle of the day. The light wasn't right, but I was still out because if you're not in it, you can't win it. If you're not looking, you won't find. And I heard some strands of saxophone music, and I followed the music, and I found this saxophonist warming up. He was waiting for his ride. He was going to a gig, and he was in front of this shotgun house, and he was dressed in orange, and the wall was pink, and it was like wild. And I photographed him, and then he said, "Well, I'm doing a new CD. I want a new CD cover." I said, "Well, let's meet tomorrow, and I'll shoot some more pictures, close-ups." And so then I went and shot some. And then he said, "Let me take you down to Kid Chic's house." Well, Kid Chic is like a god in jazz. And then he got me into all these jazz musician things. So following that sound, that initial sound of the music, was what ended up in a great set of pictures that I never would have gotten ordinarily. So it's hard to know, but you take your cue from a number of things. Another time I was working on a book in Tuscany, and I was walking in this small town, and I smelled this amazing bread. And I was like, I followed the scent, and there were all these old ladies making this boiled bread for this festival that was going to happen. So I hung out and I got them making pasta and stuff like that. And I was literally following my nose. So, but usually it's the light that draws you into these things. And you've probably picked the place because you think it has good potential for a story or for pictures. So once you make that initial choice, when you're there, you're following the visual cues. It's usually the light, but it can be the music. The camera is an excuse to be curious. It's like a passport to be curious. Ordinarily I'm kind of shy. I don't like to bother people. But with the camera in front of me, it's like a license for me to say, "Hey, what's around that corner? Where's that aroma coming from? Where's that music coming from?" And that leads you into these great picture situations. So, but it's usually the light. I had a photography column in Travel and Leisure for many years, and I used to interview other photographers who had stories in the middle of the book and they hired this very well-known portrait photographer called Michael O'Neill. At one point in the 80s and 90s, or maybe it was the 90s and the early aughts, he owned the New York Times magazine cover. Every celebrity, he was known as the portraitist for the New York Times magazine. So they gave him a travel assignment. So I schedule an interview with him, and I have all these deep questions like, what is your philosophy? Do you research? Do you do any historical research? And I'm thinking all this kind of National Geographic stuff. And he looks at me. I ask him this whole deep question. He says, "Nah," he said, "I look for the good light and I shoot what's in it." And I thought, oh my God, I'm in the presence of a Zen master. I look for the good light and I shoot what's in it. And there's a lot of truth to be that, forget all your research and all that other stuff. And is this culturally significant? It's like, is it beautiful? Does it have good light? I'll shoot it. So there is a certain degree of that and hoping to be lucky, right?
Hmm. But then, of course, Bob, if you follow your nose, it's always better because you get food and drink.
Yes. Yes, it's very important. It's very important. And one look at me, they know I'm an appreciator of food and drink. So I've been welcomed to many meals that way.
Hmm. Bob, just a moment back to National Geographic. I was wondering, would they publish a not technical picture, but it does have a great feel of a place?
Oh yeah. The moment trumps all for a geographic picture. If it's a little I remember there was a great shot from a about Central America that was shot by a staffer named Robert Madden, who was just up here through Maine. He's 86 and he's still with us, still shooting, still. And he took a plane into this outback area in Honduras or something, and he turned around to see another plane come in and hit a supply truck, and he had the presence of mind to lift his camera, and he had this impact. The truck drivers jump. It's shaky and everything,
Mhm.
but the moment was unbelievable, and they published it. So I like to say, and when I wrote a lot of my how-to travel books, I like to say that the three elements of a strong photograph are color, composition, and moment. Does it have good color or slash light? Does it have a strong composition? And does it have a sense of moment? As still photographers, we're slicing off 125th of a second in the great flow of time, and we're holding that up and saying, hey, look at this. Well, if you do that, it has to be a moment that's worthy. And
Mm.
and a beautiful light, beautiful composition is great, but for a picture to really be what I call a portfolio picture, it has to have all three. It has to have beautiful composition, beautiful light, but the sense of moment is the hardest to get,
Mm.
and I think because it's the hardest, it's the most precious. Now, there will be cadres of photographers who will disagree with me, who would never let a less than technically perfect picture pass from their cameras to their websites. But I think when you're talking about people in journalism and street
Mm.
photography, sometimes the moment trumps technical shortcomings. Now, mind you, the Geographic wouldn't publish a whole story of technically poor pictures. But if the moment was so strong, that's the last of their worries. The other two things, it's the storytelling power of whatever the picture is, the storytelling power of the moment.
Bob, I think we just touched on it before. Travel photography, you're many days away from home, and it can bring a kind of mental or a physical toll. What's for you the hardest part of it, Bob, as being a parent and a husband?
Well, the hardest part is when your kids start to get old enough to have their own lives. They are on a very regular schedule. Their soccer games, their music recitals and stuff like that. And you're away, their birthdays and things like that. So the hardest part was kind of explaining to the kids, daddy loves you, but he may not be there for your game and he may not be there for your birthday. But we kind of had a rule in our house. If we could have a party within like 2 weeks of either side of a birthday, that counted. So in our household, we kind of trained our kids to not fixate so much on the day as long as we celebrated it sometime. Now, I was fortunate in that my wife Peggy is very independent. She was very strong with the boys. She was very supportive. She ran my career. She was my agent. She did all the stock sales. She booked all the assignments. So we had a joint venture, but she was also I never and this was very rare. I never got one bit of resentment from her about, oh, you have to go again and you're leaving me with the kids. She knew that this is what we needed to do to succeed. And then as the kids got older, when they were old enough to be semi-responsible, I would take each boy on one big trip assignment as my assistant, starting from the age of about 13, once a year. So by the time those kids applied to college, they had passports this thick, and they were in Myanmar and one who was in southern India and stuff before they got to college. So they got to see a lot of the world, and so that was the perk. But the downside was that we missed birthday parties, we missed anniversaries, we missed stuff like that, but we tried to make up for it in other ways. So, but it does take its toll. But that's why National Geographic Traveler was what's much more to my speed, because being away for 3 weeks, there's a lot of businessmen who are away 3 weeks a month or whatever, but being away 3.5 months, that's start then you start to really lose touch. So but it was still hard. It was still hard, but I was blessed that the boys were pretty independent, and Peggy was very independent. And then they sure did enjoy going to Peru and Bali and all these other places as they got a little older. So it comes with its pluses and minuses.
Mm-hmm. Bob, if it's okay, I want to ask you something about emotional toll, because I know a boy of you passed away years ago,
Yes.
which I cannot imagine how it must feel. But I want to ask you how you came back to photography after that.
Well, yeah, when we lost a boy in a car accident, our youngest son, and there's no really coming back after that. It divides your life in two. There's the time before and the time after, and you're never the same. Um, Going back to photography for me after 3 or 6 months, I was on autopilot for a couple of years. My wife and I, our main concern was trying to help our other two sons deal with it. And so, and the boy we lost was our bleeding heart do-gooder, and he was involved in all these charitable causes. So in a way to try to channel some of that grief, my wife and I formed a foundation in his memory that carried on some of the work that he did. Like, he was a great musician, and he used to play in this traveling jazz band in these competitions, and he would go up against these schools that in the inner city that didn't have the same resources that he had in the suburb. So he would like collect instruments from his friends who weren't playing them, and he'd drive them over to Camden and give them to these kids in this jazz band because they were so talented, but they didn't have the same opportunities that these suburban kids had. So we continued that. We gave scholarships. We continued to do that kind of work. We kept the foundation open for almost 20 years. We raised over $1 million. We sent about 140 kids to college. We gave scholarships, and that was one way of dealing with the grief. But honest to God, Tom, you don't come back from something like that. And I can, all of us, my other two sons and my wife, we can divide our life before that time and after that time. But you have to go on, and you have to make the most of it. And after a while, going back on the road was kind of a welcome relief, because it took my mind off of those things very slightly. How my wife dealt with it was working through on the foundation thing. She was the heart and soul of the foundation, but it scars you. I don't want to say that it doesn't. You shouldn't outlive your kids. Basically, it interrupts the order of things. And when that happens, we all lose our parents and our grandparents, and that's tragic enough. But that's the way,
And
the
like a
order of
natural step.
things. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
He was in photography too.
He was a pretty good photographer, but he was a musician. Oh, he was an awesome musician. He could play the guitar, the upright bass. He was on another level with his musicianship. But we took him up to Iceland once, my wife and I, because the other two boys had been in Iceland when they were little, and we tried to get him up to Iceland, and I gave him a camera, and damn, he had a pretty good eye too. But music was his first love. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Bob, but then resilience you even reinvented then afterwards yourself, because later in life you dived headfirst after that in video.
Yes.
What gave video that still photography didn't give you anymore?
Very good question. What it gave me was the ability to tell my story of the travels. I was getting the more software that was involved with producing a photograph, the more you could mess with it, the less interested I had become in it, because it just seemed, I don't know, so technical and so divorced from, with shooting slide film was a very existential experience. You shot the picture, and if you did it right, you got a picture. And if you didn't get it right, it went into the trash can. But now, you can come and you can do frequency something and mask this and mask that. And then there started to be these things, I guess it was early AI, where you could replace the sky and you could do all this stuff. And I was like, this is, to me, I understand that it's art, but I was a journalist. I couldn't use art. I had to show the way it was. So I became less and less interested in these tarted up software pictures. At the same time, they put video capabilities in still cameras. And, being an English major, being an ex-actor, reading plays, doing all this stuff. I read Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces in college 3 or 4 times. And, the hero's journey, the story. I became very interested in the filmmaking thing. But I had used up just about all of my chops about learning new technology with going from film to digital. Now I'm going to try to learn to edit video. But I kept throwing myself at it because I wanted to tell my stories. And at that time, the magazines were dying. Geographic in the beginning would run some of my short travel documentaries on their website. But then I started getting commercial work from tourist boards. And the thing that really solidified it was I was living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a very beautiful, bucolic area. It's between New York and Philly. And the tourist board used to hire me to shoot pretty scenics and stuff. And then they said, I had done a couple of, in order to teach myself video, I had done a couple of personality profiles about interesting people. A lady who did this elaborate Halloween decorations for her house. And I did an interview and shot that. And they said, would you do some stories about Bucks County people for us? And we want this guy. We'd like to talk about antiquing in Bucks County. So I found a guy who had this specialty of antique toys, and I got him talking about it. And we started making these storytelling films. And I loved the storytelling, the story of the thing, and how deep you could go in video, and how, you did have to control a lot more things, but you could control it and you could tell a story. And without the magazines and the written word, I was always illustrating stories. I never went for like the single beautiful picture. I was shooting stories. Well, if the magazines are folding and there's no more stories, you find that you are a visual storyteller. So the video became my new passion, and I really enjoyed it. And boy, did we make some good money there in the beginning when I was still doing some of that commercial work. We did a whole series for Pennsylvania tourism, including a couple of national TV commercials and stuff, and that got me hooked. And so that's what I'm doing now. I just signed a nice contract with Maine Public Television. They saw a couple of I love to do character sketches of interesting people, shipbuilders, old antique restorers and stuff. And I do these little 5, 7, 9 minute films about these guys. And they're usually pretty interesting old characters and stuff. And this producer from Maine Public Television saw one in a film festival, and she said, "What else do you have of Maine? Because we're looking for local programming." So I just signed a contract with them, and they're going to do a block of about 5 of my stories about interesting Mainers. And then there's a new streaming station that opened up in the state, and I pitched them on a road trip, a 100th anniversary road trip for Route 1 and stuff. And I'm really enjoying this. And I love the storytelling aspect and the control. Now I'm the guy who determines what the story is, how the interview is going to go, not the writer. I do admit a certain bit of egotism in that half
Mm-hmm.
the writers I worked with, I would say, "Why
Uh-huh.
you? That is the worst interview question I've ever heard. Why are you asking that question?" Well, now I'm the interviewer, you know. So I'm doing that road trip, and then I try to help out. You know, I'm retired. Fortunately, I don't need to make money. Although, talk to me in another 6 months after what's going on with our economy, and I'll let you know about that. But
Mm-hmm.
but so I do a lot of work with local, like the land trust here in Booth Bay. They're trying to preserve land and raise money to do that. So I do some video work for them. We've got a beautiful Art Deco theater in the next town that's trying to raise some money. So I'm doing a little video pitch with them to. So I do stuff pro bono, but I do these travel stories, and that's what video gives to me is that ability to craft the whole story, because I'm not really interested in gee whiz photos anymore, because you can't unfortunately you can't trust what you see of a lot, and I've still got a pretty good eye for seeing AI, but from what I can tell from Facebook comments on pictures that are so obviously AI to me, 95% of people who are looking at these pictures have no idea whether it's real or AI. And that lack of credibility is a shame. We've the genie of credibility in photography is out of the bottle, and we're never putting them in again, I'm afraid. So, and I mean, it's going to happen with video too, with deep fake video. But at least when you're crafting a video story, it's a story, and it's not just one image. So I still love to shoot stills. I mean, I love to take my infrared modified A6000 out and shoot some black and white infrared especially like in Europe, of castles and old things
Mm-hmm.
like that, and rock formations and stuff. But video storytelling, it's still travel, but
Mm-hmm.
it's storytelling, and the storytelling is what I really, really enjoy.
Mm-hmm. So that big red lobster in Maine is not AI. It's
No,
really there.
it's the largest blow up lobster in the world, and it overlooks Route 1. So it's one of those ticky tacky things. It's the 100th anniversary of Route 1. So when road travel started in the United States in the early 1900s, the roadside attractions were the weirdest things that
Mm-hmm.
people could imagine. And so we're looking for, and there's a great aspect of that here in Maine. There's giant statues of fishermen catching sardines, and there's all kinds of weird roadside attractions that are still here 100 years later. And that's kind of what we're concentrating on, the kind of stories that are of people and places that are still a little, they're not, they're cut from their own mold. They're not polished and homogenized
Mm-hmm.
by modern culture. They're still a little rough around the edges and authentic. I think as we go on, I think authenticity is the only thing we have to sell to give anymore. We have to be authentic, because it's too easy to be slick now. And I think even the younger people who have grown up on this stuff, I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a great interest in film photography from a younger generation that never knew it earlier, but they know it now because it feels real. It's not as instantaneous as digital, and so there's something that feels authentic about it. I just laugh at these little Fuji cameras that look like they were, made back in the '70s, turning out to be like fashion statements. They can't keep them in stock, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, because the retro feel. So I think in their own way, even younger people are yearning for something authentic, and that's what I try to do in my travel stories. I'm interested in authentic people who have not been kind of polished by modern marketing society, who are still a little rough around the edges, who are genuine. And those are the people that I want to kind of profile and tell their stories.
Mm-hmm. The only thing left on the video is still, Bob, what is your secret when you tell your wife I'm going to ditch all this still photography and I'm going to buy all new video equipment.
Well, my wife has a very enlightened approach to it. She says, you don't play golf, you don't sail, you don't mess around with other women. So I guess you have to have one expensive hobby. And we used to be able to write it off, When I was in business, I could write it off, but now I'm retired, I can't write it off. So she gives me a very strict budget of what my golf and boating budget goes right into my gear. But I'm actually trying to get rid of a lot of gear. I find myself, and I don't know if you've experienced this, Tom. Sometimes you have too much stuff. You have too much to choose from. I used to like it when I was on the newspaper, I literally would shoot probably for months with a 24-on-1 camera and a 100. It was a 100 because I shot Minolta when I was first, and they didn't make a 105. They made a 100 2.5, and I had a 24 f2. And I used one for the scene setters and one for the other things. And it was very simple choice. It was the 24 or the 105, occasionally maybe a 50. Now I've got this array of like, do I want the 24-1.4? Do I want the 24-1.8? And I was like, no, this is too many choices. So I've been giving away a lot of stuff there's a media workshop, and every summer when we come back to Maine, I go through my office, I say, okay, I put together a carload of stuff, grip equipment that I'll never use, and I drive up to Maine and I donate it to their department or something like that, because I really, you reach a point in your life where it's kind of ironic. I'm at a point where I could afford to buy just about any piece of gear I wanted, but I can't carry it anymore. My knees are shot, my back hurts, so I'm looking for the smallest, lightest stuff possible, And to that end, another thing I get a kick out of is you go on YouTube and there's all these photography teachers and influencers saying, if you're a beginner, you begin with the APS-C, the crop sensor, but then as you get more pro, you're gonna need the full frame. And I'm thinking back to when digital was first introduced down at the Geographic, and how many magnificent stories were shot on the crop sensor D70, Nikon D70, and saying, really, you're going to tell those guys, so there's this full frame worship has gotten crazy, and this whole thing about equipment. Most any equipment you buy these days is good enough. It's not the equipment anymore, and we really have to convince ourselves of that. And as much as I know it, I keep thinking, I'm looking right now, I'm looking at a 16-300 uni zoom lens that Sigma just came out with, because I said, if I had that, then I could get rid of my RX 10-4 and everything. So one of the hardest arguments to make is to your significant other or your bookkeeper is, I want to pare down my equipment by buying something new. It's an oxymoron. Let me get less equipment by buying something new, and I'll sell the other stuff. Don't worry, so.
And probably it's also always better and bigger.
Yes. Yeah. And more expensive. Yeah. Now with our tariffs. Yeah. I waited on that 16 to 300. It's already gone up like $100. So I should have acted when struck while the iron was hot. But anyway.
Now you see, you're bringing all my problems because your book is never going to arrive to my home like this with all the tariffs going on.
I know. Well, I'm going to bring it.
We have to catch up here.
I'm going to deliver it. I'm going to deliver it in person next year when we're in Spain.
Very well. Time goes very fast because I wanted to talk about books, and I wanted to ask you about this old, because I even had it, the Spirit of Place.
Oh yeah, that one.
That's your old. I don't know. It's from the 2000 or something like this.
Yeah.
I even had it, and I cannot find it back. But Old Souls and Timeless Places. Quick, Bob. It's like a very personal book. I want to ask if you feel like it's a creative closure book or a kind of compilation of love letters to the kind of travel storytelling you like.
Yes, yeah. This is the book you're referring to, and it's all all black and white. And
yes,
one of the things that I always had was I always shot a lot of black and white on the side when I was shooting other assignments. And this is all part of that, whether an editor wants something or not. I tried to pitch this book to a lot of people and nobody was really interested. And it's just a collection of portraits of people who really touched me and who I think I touched during the course of my assignments, and places that seem to, it's like the anti-Instagram book is what I call it. It's the people and places that are have enough gravitas and substance to withstand change. And so after I retired, I was involved in a copyright infringement lawsuit that I had a very good lawyer, and we were wronged on many occasions by some publishers. And I got a pretty good settlement out of it. And I said, I'm going to take part of this settlement and I'm going to print my own book. And I contracted with a printer publisher down in Pennsylvania who does a lot of the great art books for George Tice and he specialized in black and white. And I hired a designer and I hired an editor and I wrote my intro and everything. And I acted as my own publisher. It's self-publishing in a way, but we printed about 1,000 of them, and I only have a few left. I'm contemplating going back to press, but that's a very expensive proposition, especially now again with tariffs and whatnot. So I did it, and I submitted it to a really tough travel journalism award called the Lowell Thomas Awards. And last year, I think George Steinmetz from National Geographic won Book of the Year. But the year I submitted this, it won Book of the Year over a lot of flashy color books. And it was very close to my heart because it was literally a labor of love. And the irony is that it was basically paid for by the fines that unscrupulous publishers had to pay me. So it's especially delicious that way, you know?
Mm-hmm. Bob, sometimes when you find an interesting person, you kind of lose track that you are a photographer and you're talking with them and you forget maybe to even take a picture. You had a moment like this somewhere?
There have been a couple of times where you walk away from a picture, not too many times, but where, there was a basic, as much of a charm barrage as you unleashed on somebody or whatever, they still really did not want to be photographed, and you have to respect that. But they're still worth talking to, and every time they'd say something interesting or you'd see an interesting expression, a little piece of you dies inside that you can't document it. But you have to respect their wishes. So it's happened a couple of times, but my charm barrage is pretty good when I'm focused on it. So it hasn't happened that often.
Bob, are you ever considering slowing down? Or what would retirement mean for you?
Well, retirement has meant for me so far just working on my own projects without having to sell them first. You know what's going to happen. The body wears out, and I'm 73 and I'm running into bad knees, bad back, and I feel it at the end of the day working. So there will come a time where even with the smallest, lightest gear, it's going to be too much of a problem. But that that when that day comes, I'll deal with it. But in the meantime, I'm trying to get as much of my stories told while I'm still able to do it. But there will come a time where it'd be time to break out all the stack of books I've been meaning to read in the last 5 or 6 years. I do listen to a lot of books when I'm driving back and forth between Maine and our place in Maryland where we go when it gets real cold up here. But yeah, some reading and just catching up with that and just seeing old friends. We're doing a lot of that already. My wife is very, very good about carving out time to see old friends. So whenever we're traveling, we're always making wide detours to see people we haven't seen in years because, that's the kind of thing before you know it, people are gone, including us. So taking the time to try to reach out and see old friends again is very important. And so there'll be time for that and everything. But so far, I still got some gas in the tank. So I'm gonna keep going.
Hmm. So you split your time between Maine and San Miguel de Allende in
W-
Mexico. I
Well,
suppose by now, Bob, you are the best ceviche chef there.
no, but I did learn how to make a pretty good margarita. We actually sold our place in Mexico, and we bought a little place down in Annapolis to be closer to our oldest boy as we got older. But we try to spend a lot of time on the road in the winters, so we don't spend that much time in Annapolis. Maine is our legal state of residence, and it's the place that in this country that that resounds with me the most. I first came up here in the early 80s to teach at the Maine Photo Workshop and had such great experiences there that when I had the freedom to not be in the New York metropolitan area, this is the first place I wanted to come and live. Of course, a
Mhm,
couple of winters up here, the older you get, the more cold averse you get generally.
mhm.
So a couple of winters up here convinced me that I was not the rugged Mainer that I thought I was. And that's when we had a place in Mexico too. So we have two very small places, and we kind of commute back and forth. But we sold San Miguel, and now we have this place in Maryland, which is a little warmer than Maine, but it's not as nice as Andalusia.
Mhm. How's your Spanish, by the way?
Terrible. If I have one regret, I don't have many regrets, but if I have one regret, it's that I I am just monolingual, and I studied French through high school and grammar school, and I can barely speak three sentences. It just didn't sink in. And being monolingual is a big regret on my part. And I've tried, but man, I'm thick as a brick. And to me, people like you who can speak two and three languages, you're like shamans. It's like magic to me. It
Mhm,
just never sunk in. My brother speaks three languages. My father, his people were from Austria. He didn't speak English until he was 7. He just came off the boat. He was born in New Jersey, and he
mhm,
didn't speak English. And we used to hear German in the house when we were younger, but in those days in the States, it was like that was the old world. And nobody ever thought, raising kids in the 50s, well, we should teach these kids our native language. It was no, we're in the new world now, and that's the old world, and we're done with it. So they didn't think to teach us the language.
mhm.
And of course, when you're in a big place like the United States, you drive thousands of miles in every direction and English is being spoken. So it's there's a little bit of an excuse why so many Americans are monolingual. But had they thought differently, like the thing that we wanted our kids, uh, that was that was tantamount. I wanted them to be bilingual. So we used to send them to Spanish language immersion camps every summer when they were old enough. And they're all my oldest boy is very fluent. The middle boy is pretty good. And the youngest guy, he was like me. He was struggling, but he got by. So we wanted to give our kids, the
Yeah.
gift of being bilingual because it skipped a generation with us.
And it can do wonders for travel photography.
Oh my
The
God,
best
yeah.
things.
And that's why, I have always tried to find a good fixer, a guide fixer
Mm,
who can translate and who has a sense of what a journalist wants. And because you're very dependent on when you're monolingual on the fixer kind of telling you what's going on and helping you arrange things. Otherwise you're boxed off like this. And
mm.
it's a
Yeah.
definite disadvantage in my line of work. And had I had a second or third language, it would have been so much better. But that ship has sailed for me, unfortunately. But my kids are bilingual, so that's something.
Yeah, it moves on.
Yeah.
Bob, to end this, I have a question. It's not about photography, but I see you sitting there when this comes out and you two people can see with all your lush white hair, your big white beard. And I want to ask you, Bob, how much extra revenue you make in December dressing up as Santa Claus?
You know, you laugh, but I was down getting my hair cut. There's this young lady who runs a hair salon just down the street, and she's an inveterate traveler. So whenever I go, we're always swapping tales. She's been all over the world teaching English in Japan and South America. And the last winter, just before I left, I was getting pretty shaggy, and I went down there, and she said, down at the Portland Mall, they're paying $18, $19 an hour for the Santa Clauses. She said, "You sure you want me to cut your hair? Because you can go down there right now." And I'm like, and once when I was an actor in my 20s, and I was with the Berkeley Stage Company, and we were so broke that it was Christmas time. And in the States, there used to be, it was called Western Temporary. All the department store Santa Clauses are hired by an employment agency. The stores don't hire them. This employment agency hires them and sends them out to stores. And I remember walking past the window of the office of Western Temporary with this big thing of Santa Claus saying, "Can you fill his shoes?" And I was 22, broke, and I said, "Yeah, I'm kind of, I'm just rehearsing in the days. My evenings are free now. I want to go in." So I actually did go in, and I spent one Christmas season playing Santa Claus in a J.C. Penney in a ghetto in Oakland, California, which was life changing.
Yes.
So, but that's the first and last time I've ever played it, except for my nieces and nephews at Christmas time or something like that. But I had to laugh when Nikki, the lady that does my hair, said, "Yeah, they're paying like $18, $19 an hour for Santa Clauses down at the Portland Mall," and I was like, "No, you'd have to pay me a lot more than that." I've been there, done that, when I was young and broke.
Bob, it has been an amazing talk. I think we have to cut it here and we will catch up soon. I have to thank you to give me your time
Oh, my
to talk
pleasure.
about travel photography, and maybe people listening get a better idea of what they should point their camera to next time.
I hope so. Yeah.
There is still more to explore down the road, but I hope to catch up with you in real life. Bob, we have to talk about your project that maybe you want to do in Belgium.
Yes.
Yes, we will have a duvel beer or a coffee, and you will give me your book. I will be very happy.
Okay. That sounds like a good plan.
That sounds good, plan. Bob, we will be in touch and have a nice day still. Greetings to your wife. Ooh,
Thank
before
you.
I forget.
Thank you. I'll pass on your
Okay.
greetings.
I will see you soon, Bob.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye. And that was my talk with Bob Krist for today, folks. What makes real travel photography so meaningful is not just where it takes you, but how deeply it allows you to connect with the people and the places you encounter. If you want to know more about Bob and his work, you can find everything back in the show notes. You know that you can listen to this episode and, of course, many more in the podcast channel too. And if you enjoyed this talk here today, the stories, and maybe had a few laughs along the way, subscribe, leave a comment, and let us know which part stayed with you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week here on the channel where photography stories brew hotter than coffee. Adios.